Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. The other day I received an email from the National Library. Now, I'd previously donated some money to them to help them digitise their collection of political ephemera. All those quite annoying political signs and how to vote cards and flyers that fill your letterbox can later be fascinating history showing us what the concerns of the day were and how people campaigned. The email provided a link to the work that the National Library has already done on digitising material from the election period of 1901 to 1910. So in this video, I thought I'd use some of that material as a prompt to talk about the quite fascinating history of the 1901 election, the first federal election in Australia. But before doing that, the National Library was also asking for help for collecting political ephemera for the 2025 federal election. So here's your opportunity to make, or at least preserve, history by sending it material. It says that it's looking for printed campaign material, including candidate newsletters, how to vote cards, posters, pamphlets, badges, stickers, t-shirts and hats that promote parties, candidates or election issues. It wants material from every electorate, candidate, party and lobby group. It's particularly interested in material that records the current issues of the day. But, of course, it doesn't want anything that's torn or dirty, mouldy or damaged or otherwise in poor condition, so please don't send them that. You can send items to the National Library in an A4 envelope or smaller for free to the address Federal Election Campaign Ephemera, Curatorial and Collection Research, National Library of Australia, reply paid 83399 Canberra ACT 2600, or if you happen to be in Canberra, there are deposit boxes in the library's reading room. So here's your chance to do something useful with all of that electoral material and to make a contribution to history so that people can look back with amazement at it in 100 years' time or so. The other interesting thing that the National Library preserves is online material related to the election. For the 2022 election, it collected over 1,000 websites and also various communications on sites like Twitter, from blogs, from Reddit, all of those sorts of places. Even as a matter of short-term history, that can be quite useful because people do tend to delete contentious material from their social media timelines and attempt to rewrite history. But the National Library preserves it in all its original glory. It has a quite interesting collection of material on the voice referendum as well, for example. It's definitely worth checking out its Australian Web Archive on elections and by-elections, and I've put the link here. Now, moving away from recent history, let's go back to that first federal election in 1901. There was a chicken and egg issue because you needed to have a government and public service in order to organise and run a federal election. But you needed the federal election to elect the members of Parliament to form the government. This problem was addressed in the Constitution by allowing the Queen Victoria, under Covering Clause 3, to appoint a Governor-General before Federation came into existence. The Governor-General could then appoint an interim ministry and establish a public service before the running of the first election. And that's what happened. The Governor-General initially blundered, as they say, in seeking to appoint William Lyne, the Premier of New South Wales, to be the first Prime Minister. This didn't work out because Lyne had opposed Federation and didn't have enough support to be able to form a government. Lyne advised the Governor-General of his failure, and then Edmund Barton was asked to form a government, which he did. That government was sworn in by the Governor-General on the 1st of January 1901, immediately after the Commonwealth Constitution came into force. The other problem with holding the first election was that there'd be no electoral laws in place to govern it, because the Commonwealth Parliament had not yet been established to enact such laws. The Constitution dealt with this by relying on the existing franchise for the lower house in each of the states, until of course the Parliament could provide otherwise. Section 29 gave the state parliaments the power to make laws for determining the divisions in each state for the election of members of the House of Representatives, but if a state didn't do so, each state was then to be comprised of one electorate with multiple members. Section 26 set out the number of members to be chosen from each state at the first federal election, ranging from 26 in New South Wales to the constitutional minimum of 5 in both Tasmania and Western Australia. In total, there were to be 75 members of the House of Representatives and 36 members in the Senate, being 6 states with 6 senators each. At that time, Australia had a population of 3.77 million. New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland and Western Australia all passed laws setting out electorate divisions for the first federal election. For example, the Federal Elections Act 1900 of New South Wales sets out details concerning Senate elections, the issue of the writs, and the division of New South Wales for the House of Representatives, with 1 member to be elected per division. It also provided for the seats of members of the state parliament to be vacated if those members were elected to the Commonwealth Parliament. No one would be able to serve in both parliaments at the same time. Interestingly, South Australia and Tasmania did not create any electoral divisions, so that in the very first election, the entire state was one multi-member electorate. Now this brings us to the voting systems that we used. Tasmania used the Hare-Clark system of proportional representation, which was quite handy for a multi-member electorate. Most of the other states used first past the post and required voters to strike out the names of all of those that they were not voting for. Queensland, however, had a limited form of preferential voting, allowing a voter to give a contingent vote in case no candidate gained a majority. South Australia had innovated by requiring voters to mark a box next to the voters' preferred candidates rather than striking out all of those names. South Australia also permitted what was known as plumping, which meant that voters could choose to vote for fewer candidates than there were vacancies, although very few of them actually did so. The method of striking out the names of unwanted candidates resulted in very high numbers of informal votes. Alfred Deakin claimed that in New South Wales nearly 40,000 votes were wasted in the attempt to strike out exactly 44 names from a list of 50, leaving only 6 unmarked. The franchise was significantly different in each colony. Sections 8 and 30 of the Commonwealth Constitution nonetheless provided that the qualification for federal electors shall be the same as that for the lower house of the relevant state, of course until the Commonwealth Parliament otherwise provided, but that in choosing members, each member shall vote only once. That qualification was directed at plural voting based upon property ownership, where a voter could vote in different electorates in which the elector owned property. By the time of federation, most of the states had already dropped property voting franchises, but it was something that the framers were concerned about and wished to exclude. Some people wrongly claim today that preferential voting and proportional voting are unlawful, unconstitutional, because they involve electors voting more than once. That's not so, and the High Court has rejected that argument in the case of Ditchburn and Divisional Returning Officer from 1999. It held that under a preferential system, a voter's ballot is a single expression of the will of that voter. The voter votes only once, not in a number of different electorates. I'll do a separate video about the different franchise in each of the different colonies because it's quite interesting. People were disqualified for more things than you'd imagine. The law under which the election was held in each state was the law of that state in accordance with sections 10 and 31 of the Commonwealth Constitution. These provisions allowed the Commonwealth Parliament, once established, to enact its own laws about the franchise, the voting system and the running of elections, although the states do retain a small area of jurisdiction in relation to Senate elections as discussed in an earlier video. Other interesting features about the first federal election were the turnout, which was quite low. It was only 51.39% of registered voters who turned out to vote. It was also run over 2 days, with Western Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Tasmania holding the election on Friday, the 29th of March, and South Australia and Queensland holding it on Saturday, the 30th of March. And this was because different state laws provided for voting on different days. Flooding in Queensland also delayed some polling there. There was also a small link to Australia's convict past. One of the members elected, William Groome, had been transported to Australia from England as a convict in 1846 for theft. Groome died not long after his election to the Commonwealth Parliament at its first sitting in Melbourne on the 8th of August 1901. He could never have imagined at the time that he was transported across the other side of the world to a foreign land as a convict that he would end up representing that place both in the Queensland Colonial Parliament and in its first federal parliament. In addition, 6 seats at the 1901 election were uncontested and were therefore won by the only candidate without the need for a ballot. This seems to have been done out of respect for some of the leaders of the Federation movement, such as Edmund Barton, so that they could continue to both govern and campaign nationally without the burden of running a local campaign. Although the political party system had not fully developed by that time, there were 3 major groupings with some fluidity across them. Edmund Barton led the Protectionists, who campaigned in some states under the party name of Australian Liberal and Protectionist Organisation, which was abbreviated as ALPO. So they were the Alpos. Then there were the Free Traders under George Reid and Labor candidates, who were later led by Chris Watson. The big issue at the election was tariffs, with George Reid describing that election as a plebiscite on tariffs. But you can see from the voting pamphlets held by the National Library that other considerations also came into play. I rather like the one from Dougal Thompson, who was running for North Sydney. In answer to the rhetorical question of why vote for him, he said, "Because he has proved by his speeches in the campaign the possession of broad and liberal views, his thorough knowledge of the constitutional questions of the Commonwealth, and his complete grasp of issues with which Parliament will have to deal." You won't hear a claim like that in political advertising today. As for Mr. Fowler in Western Australia, he seemed to have quite a complicated position on the tariff. He declared himself to be a revenue tariffist on a free trade basis, which must at the same time be incidentally protective. He'd give Donald Trump a run for his money there. It's quite hard to give precise figures about the outcome of that 1901 election because it is quite hard to put people in the baskets of particular categories or groupings because they tended to move across them. And allegiances to candidates were also significant as well. So, for example, people who were personally allied to Barton because of his role in the Federation movement were not necessarily all protectionists. And Labor included both supporters of protectionism and free trade. However, what is known is that the protectionists did form a minority government under Barton with the support of the Labor Party. Indeed, Labor held the balance of power in both houses, having done better in the Senate than in the House of Representatives. As most of the candidates for the federal election were existing politicians in state parliaments, there were also familiar allegations about the misuse of state government resources, including vehicles and rail passes, in order to campaign in the federal election. Some things never change. Now, my last comment today is a bit of a rant. I received an envelope in my letterbox yesterday saying, "Important voting information for the federal election." And by the way, it had been raining, so it's a bit wet. Anyway, inside there was a postal vote application form And the form itself appears to be the form provided by the Australian Electoral Commission. It asks for lots of personal information such as name, enrolled address, postal address, date of birth, email address, mobile phone number and home phone number, if you've still got one. It also includes a security question which can include personal details such as where you were born or the school you attended, etc. Now, an envelope was provided to return the form, but if you look at the address on the envelope, oh, it's being returned to a political party, not to the Electoral Commission. Why is that? No doubt the party will eventually be kind enough to pass it on to the Electoral Commission after having scanned and harvested all your personal information, which it then can use for things like robocalls and other campaigning purposes. To me, this is just appalling. It's effectively a data harvesting scam, and both sides do it. How safe is that data that you give them? How easily could it be hacked? What might it eventually be used for? We don't know. My very strong recommendation is to be extremely careful about providing any such data except directly to the Australian Electoral Commission. Look closely at any envelope or website, including the QR code on this one, which I wasn't even game to touch. And don't send that information to political parties because, frankly, you should not trust them with your personal data. Certainly I don't. Anyway, thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and as always, I look forward to seeing you again next time. Goodbye.